The ash swirled around Albert's boots as he trudged through the desolate landscape. Each step kicked up small clouds of gray particles that danced briefly in the toxic air before settling back down. Above him, a sickly green sky cast an eerie glow over the ruins of what had once been a magnificent alien metropolis, now known simply as the alien graveyard. Albert adjusted his respirator and pulled his tattered coat tighter around his gaunt frame. 20 years of scavenging had taught him to read this deadly environment like an open book. The hulking structures that loomed overhead, once architectural marvels of a vanished civilization, were now just silent tombs waiting to collapse. Even the air itself was an enemy, laced with radiation and chemicals that would slowly eat away at human lungs. He paused to consult the crude map he'd sketched on a piece of scrap leather. According to his calculations, there should be an untouched sector just beyond the next ridge of rubble. Untouched meant potential treasures, rare metals, functioning technology, perhaps even preserved food supplies. The thought made his empty stomach growl in anticipation. As he navigated around a particularly precarious tower of debris, Albert caught a glimpse of his reflection in a shard of polished metal. Sunken eyes stared back at him from a face weathered by harsh elements and harsher disappointments. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from an encounter with scavengers who tried to take his haul 3 winters ago. Albert quickly looked away. His appearance didn't matter out here. Nothing mattered except survival, finding enough valuable scrap to trade for rations and clean water at the outpost. One day at a time. That had been his mantra since Sarah and Emma. He shut down that line of thought immediately. The past was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not here. Not now. As Albert resumed his trek, something unusual caught his attention. A faint sound. Something different from the constant moaning of the toxic wind through broken structures or the occasional collapse of unstable ruins. He froze, head tilted, listening intently. There was again. A small, rhythmic tapping, almost like a signal. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it. Strange noises in the graveyard often meant danger. Territorial scavengers, radiation-mutated vermin, or worse. But something about the deliberate pattern of the sound tugged at his curiosity. With practiced caution, Albert unholstered his makeshift pistol and slowly moved toward the source of the noise. It led him to what appeared to have been some kind of ceremonial building, its once grand entrance now half buried under rubble. The sound was coming from inside. Taking a deep breath, Albert squeezed through a narrow opening in the debris. The interior was dim, illuminated only by patches of sickly light filtering through gaps in the ceiling. The tapping grew louder, more distinct. He rounded a fallen column and stopped dead in his tracks. In a small clearing among the rubble lay what at first glance appeared to be a corpse. But corpses didn't make tapping noises. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, Albert realized he was looking at a living being. Not human, but one of the indigenous aliens whose civilization had collapsed decades ago. A girl, or at least Albert assumed it was female from its slender build. Her skin was a pale blue that seemed to emit the faintest luminescence, creating a subtle glow around her form. 6 fingers adorned each hand, and where a human's ears would be, she had delicate fin-like structures that quivered slightly with each labored breath. But most striking were her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and a swirling violet color that seemed to contain galaxies. She was alive, but barely. One of her hands weakly tapped a small piece of metal against the stone floor, the sound that had drawn Albert. Her lower body appeared completely immobile, her legs thin and atrophied. Beside her lay a broken device of some kind, possibly a mobility aid. Albert knelt beside her, his mind racing. She had been abandoned here. That much was clear. Perhaps her family couldn't or wouldn't continue to care for a paralyzed member, especially in this harsh environment where every resource was precious. They had left her to die. Something twisted painfully in Albert's chest as unwanted memories surged forward. Sarah's face, pale and desperate as she begged him to find medicine for their daughter. Emma's tiny hand, burning with fever, clutching his finger. The storm that had delayed his return by 3 days. The silence that greeted him when he finally made it back to their shelter with the antibiotics. Too late. Always too late. The alien girl's eyes fixed on him, and Albert saw the terror there. She tried to drag herself away, her movements feeble and uncoordinated. "Easy," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand him. "I'm not going to hurt you." Every logical part of his brain told him to leave. She was a burden he couldn't afford. Taking care of himself was hard enough in this hellscape. Adding another mouth to feed, an alien one at that, was suicide. She would slow him down, consume precious resources, attract unwanted attention. He should walk away. Right now. The alien girl made a soft, keening sound as she struggled to move, her eyes never leaving his face. In them, Albert saw the same desperation he'd seen in Sarah's eyes. The same plea for help he'd seen in Emma's. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his grimy hair. "Damn it all to hell." With a resigned sigh, Albert carefully set down his pack and began to assess the situation. The girl flinched when he reached toward her, but relaxed slightly when he offered her his water canteen. She drank greedily, confirming his suspicion that she had been abandoned for at least a day or two. "I'm Albert," he said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured to her with a questioning look. The alien girl hesitated, then made a series of melodic clicks and trills that were clearly her language. Seeing his confusion, she tried again, this time producing sounds closer to human speech. "Ray," she managed, her voice high and musical despite its weakness. "Ray," Albert repeated. "Well, Ray, I'm probably making the biggest mistake of my life, but I'm going to get you out of here." He fashioned a crude stretcher from his coat and some debris, then carefully lifted Lyrae onto it. She was surprisingly light, her bones fragile beneath his calloused hands. As he prepared to move her, Albert found himself making a silent promise to the ghosts of his past. "Not this time. This time I won't be too late." The journey through the ruins was treacherous and slow. Each step had to be calculated, each path carefully evaluated for stability and safety. Albert's shoulders burned with the effort of dragging the makeshift stretcher while still maintaining vigilance for threats. Lyrae remained silent throughout much of the journey, though occasional soft whimpers escaped her when the stretcher jostled over particularly rough terrain. Albert tried to be gentle, but gentleness was a luxury in the graveyard. The toxic air grew thicker as the day progressed, forcing Albert to share his respirator with Lyrae in alternating intervals. Her alien physiology seemed somewhat more resistant to the poisonous atmosphere, but even she struggled to breathe as they traversed areas of concentrated contamination. By the time dusk began to settle, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruined landscape, Albert's muscles screamed for rest. His water supply was dangerously low, and he'd already used most of his emergency rations to keep up his strength. "We need shelter," he muttered, scanning the horizon. And soon, as if in answer to his unspoken prayer, Albert spotted a structure in the distance that seemed more intact than its surroundings. As they drew closer, he recognized it as some kind of maintenance facility, a squat, utilitarian building partially buried in the side of a hill. Most importantly, it appeared stable, with minimal structural damage. "This will have to do," he told Lyrae, who watched him with those unsettlingly beautiful violet eyes. The facility's entrance was blocked by debris, but Albert managed to clear enough space for them to squeeze through. Inside, the air was stale but significantly less toxic. The space consisted of several small rooms filled with abandoned equipment, much of it still recognizable despite its alien design. A control room, storage areas, and what appeared to be living quarters for maintenance workers. Albert laid Lyrae down on a relatively clean surface in the main room, then set about securing their temporary haven. He barricaded the entrance they'd used and checked for other possible points of entry. Satisfied they were reasonably safe, he turned his attention to his new charge. In the dim light of his portable lamp, he examined Lyrae more carefully. Her paralysis seemed to affect everything below her waist. Whether it was an injury or a congenital condition, he couldn't tell. There were also several wounds on her torso and arms. Some appeared to be from rough handling, others from exposure to the harsh environment. Albert cleaned the wounds as best he could with his limited medical supplies, wincing in sympathy when Lyrae hissed in pain. He fashioned bandages from the cleanest scraps of fabric he could find and covered the worst injuries. "I don't know much about alien biology," he admitted as he worked, "but infection is probably bad news for both our species." When he finished with her wounds, Albert turned his attention to their most pressing needs: water, food, and warmth. The facility's water reclamation system was miraculously still partially functional. After some tinkering, he managed to extract a few liters of water that, while not entirely clean, was at least free of the worst contaminants. Food was more problematic. Albert had only a few protein bars left in his pack, enough for maybe 2 days if they rationed carefully. He had no idea what Lyrae could safely eat or how their nutritional needs might differ. As for warmth, the facility's environmental systems were long dead. Albert gathered what materials he could find to create insulated bedding and used his emergency thermal blanket to wrap Lyrae. Throughout his preparations, Lyrae watched his every move with an expression that mixed fear, confusion, and the faintest glimmer of hope. When he finally settled down beside her, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders, she made a soft clicking sound and tentatively reached out to touch his hand. "I don't know what you're saying," Albert sighed, "but I hope it's thank you and not I'm going to murder you in your sleep." The joke fell flat even to his own ears. He was too tired, too overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility he'd taken on. What was he thinking bringing her here? He could barely keep himself alive in this hellscape. As if sensing his doubts, Lyrae's hand tightened around his. Her eyes, those swirling violet pools, locked onto his with an intensity that transcended language barriers. In that moment, something passed between them. A wordless understanding. A fragile bond. Albert squeezed her hand gently in return, then settled back against the wall to take the first watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, they were safe. It was more than either of them had had in a long time. When Lyrae woke the next morning, she panicked. The unfamiliar surroundings, the pain in her body, and the memory of being abandoned all crashed over her at once. She let out a series of high-pitched trills that Albert recognized as distress calls. Hey, he said softly, approaching with hands held open in a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay. You're safe. Remember me? Albert." He pointed to himself, then carefully offered her water. The simple act of kindness seemed to penetrate her fear. Her trilling subsided, replaced by cautious observation as she accepted the water. The next few days established a tenuous routine. Albert would venture out briefly to scavenge for supplies, never going far from their shelter. Each time he left, Lyrae's eyes would fill with terror, her hand reaching out to grasp his sleeve as if to prevent his departure. Each time he returned, the relief on her alien features was palpable. Communication remained their greatest challenge. Lyrae could approximate a few human sounds, and Albert quickly learned some of her clicks and trills, but complex ideas remained beyond their linguistic capabilities. Instead, they developed a rudimentary sign language, supplemented by drawings and gestures. Through these limited means, Albert pieced together fragments of Lyrae's story. Her people, once a thriving civilization, had been devastated by a combination of environmental disasters and internal conflicts. Survivors formed nomadic clans, constantly on the move to escape the spreading contamination. Those who couldn't keep up, the elderly, the ill, the disabled, were often left behind. A harsh reality of a dying world. Lyrae had been born with her paralysis, apparently a genetic mutation becoming more common as radiation altered her species' DNA. Her family had carried her for years, but resources grew scarcer, dangers more frequent. Eventually, the burden became too great. They left her in the ceremonial building, a place of significance to her people, perhaps as a final act of respect before condemning her to death. The story resonated painfully with Albert. One evening, as Lyrae dozed beside him, he found himself speaking aloud for the first time about his own loss. "I had a family once," he said quietly, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but needing to voice them nonetheless. My wife, Sarah. My daughter, Emma. We were living in a settlement to the east when a fever swept through. Emma got sick, so sick. The settlement had run out of antibiotics. I volunteered to go to the trading post for medicine. Albert's voice cracked as he continued. There was a storm. Delayed me by 3 days. When I got back, he swallowed hard. They were both gone. Sarah had gotten sick too, trying to care for Emma. No one helped them. Everyone was too afraid of the fever. He brushed away the wetness on his cheeks. I've been alone ever since. Figured it was safer that way. No one to lose again. Lirai stirred in her sleep, unconsciously reaching out. Her hand found Albert's arm, resting there with gentle pressure. Though she hadn't understood his words, the connection brought unexpected comfort. As weeks passed, their shelter improved. Albert repurposed salvage materials to create more comfortable living spaces. He discovered that Lirai possessed an innate understanding of her people's technology, and with her guidance, he managed to restore partial function to some of the facility's systems, including a rudimentary heating element. Food remained their greatest challenge until Albert discovered a fungal growth in one of the facility's maintenance tunnels. After careful testing, first on himself, then in small amounts for Lirai, he determined it was safe for both species to consume. It tasted terrible, but provided essential nutrients. Lirai's health gradually improved. The wounds healed, her strength returned, and her eyes regained their luminous quality. She demonstrated remarkable adaptability, using her powerful arms to pull herself around their shelter, refusing to be limited by her paralysis. One evening, as they shared their meager meal, Lirai made a series of gestures that took Albert by surprise. She pointed to her legs, made a walking motion with her fingers, then pointed to various mechanical parts Albert had salvaged. You want to walk? Albert asked, mimicking her gestures. Lirai nodded vigorously, then sketched a crude drawing in the dust. It depicted a humanoid figure with mechanical legs, prosthetics. Albert stared at the drawing, his mind racing. You think we could build prosthetic legs for you? Is that even possible? Lirai's expression conveyed her certainty. She pointed to herself, then to her head, then made gestures suggesting knowledge or understanding. You know how it works, Albert realized. Your people had this technology. Another eager nod. But we don't have the materials or tools, Albert objected, gesturing around their limited shelter. Lirai's response was to draw another image, a crude map. She indicated a location far to the south, then made gestures suggesting trade and technology. A market? Some kind of trading post. When Lirai confirmed, Albert shook his head. That's deep market. It's dangerous, crawling with the worst kind of scavengers and smugglers. Not to mention, it's at least a week's journey from here. Lirai's violet eyes held his, unwavering in their determination. She touched her chest, then touched his, then repeated the walking gesture. The message was clear. Together, we can make this happen. Albert ran a hand through his beard, considering the insanity of what she was proposing. Even if I could get there and back alive, the kind of tech you're talking about would cost more than everything I've scavenged in the last 5 years. Lirai's expression didn't change. Her faith in him was absolute and utterly terrifying. That night, Albert couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the drawing Lirai had made, the figure standing on mechanical legs. He thought about the way her eyes lit up at the possibility of walking. He remembered the feeling of carrying Emma on his shoulders, her delighted laughter as she stretched her arms toward the sky. By morning, his decision was made. I'll go, he told Lirai over breakfast. But we need to prepare carefully. I'll be gone for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. The preparation took 3 days. Albert reinforced their shelter, creating hidden compartments for Lirai to hide in if danger approached. He stockpiled water and food, set up warning systems, and taught Lirai how to use his pistol, a last resort if the worst happened. The morning of his departure was difficult. Lirai clung to him, her usual composure breaking as fear took hold. Albert gently disentangled himself from her grip. I promise I'll come back, he said, looking directly into her eyes to convey his sincerity. I promise. With those words, he stepped out into the toxic wasteland, more determined than he had been in years. The journey to Deep Market was every bit as treacherous as Albert had anticipated. The terrain grew increasingly unstable as he moved south, with wide fissures splitting the earth in pockets of concentrated radiation that his detector could barely warn him about in time. Twice he encountered other scavengers. Once he hid until they passed. The other time he traded small salvaged items for information about the path ahead. By the seventh day, the landscape began to change. The ruins became more haphazard, with makeshift structures cobbled together from the remains of the alien city. Crude symbols marked territory boundaries, warnings to those who might trespass unwittingly. Albert approached Deep Market cautiously. From his vantage point on a hillside, the settlement looked like a cancerous growth amid the ruins, a chaotic sprawl of tents, containers, and repurposed alien structures. Fires burned in metal drums, casting ominous shadows. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their weapons a mix of salvaged alien technology and human ingenuity. Taking a deep breath, Albert descended toward the market. At the checkpoint, he surrendered his visible weapons, keeping a small blade hidden in his boot, and paid the entry fee with a handful of rare mineral crystals he'd been saving. The interior of Deep Market assaulted his senses. Hundreds of voices haggled in a dozen languages. Acrid smoke hung in the air, mixed with the smell of cooking meat of questionable origin and chemical fumes from improvised laboratories. Vendors shouted their wares from stalls constructed of scrap metal and salvage panels. Some sold food and water, others offered weapons, medicines, or recreational substances. The most profitable businesses, however, dealt in technology, particularly the forbidden fusion of alien and human design. Albert navigated the crowded pathways, scanning for someone who might deal in medical technology. After several hours and many fruitless inquiries, he was directed to a structure on the market's periphery, a domed building with strange symbols etched into its metal surface. The interior was dimly lit and cluttered with mechanical parts, tools, and half-finished projects. The air smelled of solvents and ozone. At the center of the space, hunched over a workbench, was a figure that made Albert pause. The man, if he could still be called that, was a disturbing hybrid of human and machine. His left arm and the entire right side of his face had been replaced with mechanical components, some clearly of alien design. When he turned to regard Albert, one human eye and one glowing blue optical sensor fixed on him with unnerving intensity. "What do you want?" the cyborg demanded, his voice carrying a metallic undertone. Albert explained his need as concisely as possible, describing Lyrai's condition and the type of prosthetics they hoped to create. The cyborg, who called himself Vertex, listened with increasing interest. Alien prosthetics for an alien, he mused, the mechanical parts of his face whirring slightly as he processed the information. Fascinating. Possible, certainly, but expensive. Very expensive. "Name your price," Albert said, though his stomach knotted at the thought of what that price might be. Vertex named a figure that made Albert's heart sink. It was, as he had feared, far beyond anything he could offer. However, the cyborg continued, noting Albert's expression, "I might be willing to accept an alternative form of payment." The proposal Vertex laid out was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. North of Deep Market, in a restricted zone controlled by a rival faction, was an abandoned research facility. Inside that facility was a particular piece of alien technology, a neural interface that Vertex coveted for his own continuing enhancements. "Retrieve this for me," he said, projecting a holographic image of the device, "and I will build your friend the finest prosthetics this side of the wasteland." "That's a suicide mission," Albert protested. "That area is crawling with razors." The razors were notorious for their brutality, decorating their territory with the remains of trespassers. "Hence the value of the exchange," Vertex replied coolly. "Do we have a deal?" Albert thought of Lyrai waiting in their shelter, her violet eyes full of hope and trust. He thought of the drawing she had made, the figure standing proudly on mechanical legs. "We have a deal," he said. 3 days later, bleeding from multiple wounds and sporting a fresh burn across his left shoulder, Albert staggered back into Vertex's workshop. The neural interface, a delicate, crystalline structure housed in a protective case, was clutched in his trembling hands. Vertex's human eye widened in genuine surprise. "You actually succeeded. Impressive." He took the device reverently, examining it under a specialized light. "Yes, this will do nicely. Very nicely indeed." Albert collapsed into a chair, his body finally registering the full extent of his exhaustion and injuries. "The prosthetics? Already in production," Vertex assured him, gesturing to a fabrication unit humming in the corner. "I'll need another day to complete them, calibrate the neural response system, and adapt the interface for your friend's specific physiology." Albert nodded wearily. One more day. He could manage one more day. True to his word, Vertex delivered the prosthetics the following evening. They were marvels of engineering, sleek, articulated limbs made from a lightweight alloy, with complex internal mechanisms for natural movement. The neural interface components were designed to bond directly with Lyrae's nervous system without invasive surgery. "They will learn and adapt to her specific needs," Vertex explained as he demonstrated the features. "The pain will be significant during initial calibration, but temporary. After that, they should function almost as well as natural limbs." Albert listened carefully to the instructions, committing every detail to memory. When Vertex finished his explanation, Albert asked, "Why help us? You could have just taken a neural interface and killed me." The cyborg was silent for a moment, his mechanical eye whirring as it adjusted focus. "Perhaps I retain more humanity than is apparent," he said finally. "Or perhaps I simply appreciate the technical challenge your request presented." With the prosthetics securely packed and additional supplies for the journey home, including proper medical equipment for treating his wounds, Albert prepared to leave Deep Market. As he turned to go, Vertex called after him. "Your friend," the cyborg said. "She is fortunate to have someone willing to face death for her sake. Such loyalty is uncommon in our world." Albert offered no response beyond a curt nod. He had what he came for. It was time to return to Lyrae. The journey back was arduous. Albert's injuries slowed his pace considerably, and the precious cargo he carried required extra caution. He rationed his supplies carefully, pushing through pain and exhaustion with single-minded determination. By the time their shelter came into view on the 14th day, Albert was running on sheer willpower. His wounds had reopened, infection setting in despite his best efforts. Fever made the landscape waver before his eyes. Each step felt like walking through deep sand. He managed to signal Lyrae with their prearranged pattern before collapsing just inside the entrance. Albert awoke to the sensation of something cool and damp against his forehead. Opening his eyes, he found Lyrae leaning over him, her face tight with concern. She had somehow dragged herself and a water container to his side and was bathing his face with a makeshift compress. "I made it," he croaked, his throat parched. "Got your legs." Relief flooded Lyrae's features. She helped him drink, then gestured urgently to his wounds. Using their improvised sign language, she communicated that she had been treating him for 3 days while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Despite his protests, Lyrae insisted on continuing to care for him until his fever broke and his strength began to return. She had clearly studied the medical supplies he'd left behind, applying treatments with surprising skill. The roles they had established in the beginning, protector and protected, had temporarily reversed. It was another week before Albert was well enough to begin the process of fitting Lyrae with her new prosthetics. During that time, they carefully reviewed Vertex's instructions, preparing both the equipment and themselves for what would be a painful and challenging procedure. "This is going to hurt," Albert warned as he laid out the components. "A lot." Lyrae's expression conveyed her understanding and readiness. She had waited lifetimes for this moment. The procedure began with the attachment of neural interface nodes along Lyrae's spine and at key points on her lower body. Albert's hands, normally steady from years of delicate salvage work, trembled slightly with the weight of responsibility. One mistake could cause permanent damage or unbearable pain. When the interface nodes were in place, Albert carefully positioned the prosthetic legs against Lirai's atrophied limbs. The advanced technology began to work immediately, adhering to her body and establishing the neural connections. Lirai's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Her body arched in agony, a keening cry escaping her throat as the neural pathways were forged. Albert held her hands tightly, his own eyes damp as he watched her suffer through a pain he had brought upon her. "It's working," he assured her, hoping his tone conveyed what his words couldn't. "It's working. Just hold on." The initial bonding process lasted nearly an hour. By the end, Lirai was exhausted, her luminescent skin dulled with stress, her breathing shallow. But when Albert checked the connection points, he saw the technology had integrated seamlessly. According to Vertex's instructions, the worst was over. For the next few days, Lirai rested, allowing her body to adjust to the foreign presence. The prosthetics, true to Vertex's claims, began to adapt to her unique physiology, their internal mechanisms recalibrating to optimize function. On the fourth day, she indicated she was ready to try standing. Albert cleared a space in the center of their shelter and positioned himself beside her, ready to provide support. Lirai took a deep breath, her violet eyes focused with determination. Using her arms to brace herself, she carefully commanded the prosthetics to move. The mechanical legs responded sluggishly at first, jerking in uncoordinated movements. Lirai winced but persisted, her concentration absolute. Gradually, the prosthetics bent at the knee, planted firmly on the ground, and began to straighten. Slowly, tremulously, Lirai rose to a standing position. For a moment, both of them were too stunned to react. Lirai stood unsteadily, her hands gripping Albert's arms for balance, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then, as the reality of the moment sank in, her face transformed with a joy so pure it seemed to illuminate the room. Albert found himself laughing, a rusty, unfamiliar sound he hadn't produced in years. "You're standing," he said unnecessarily. "Lirai, you're standing." She attempted to take a step forward and immediately began to fall. Albert caught her easily, supporting her weight as her new legs buckled. "Whoa, easy there," he cautioned. "One miracle at a time." Over the following weeks, Lirai's progress was remarkable. Her determination drove her to practice constantly, often to the point of exhaustion. Albert fashioned parallel bars from salvage pipes to help her practice walking safely. Each day brought new achievements. First one shaky step, then three, then a full circuit of their shelter. Falls were frequent and often painful, but Lirai refused to be discouraged. After each failure, she would look up at Albert with those extraordinary violet eyes, and he would see in them not defeat, but renewed resolve. One particularly difficult day, after a fall that left her frustrated and in tears, Albert knelt beside her. "You know," he said gently, "my daughter took her first steps right before her first birthday." He pantomimed a baby walking, knowing Lirai would understand the concept. She fell down about 100 times before she got it right. But she kept trying, just like you're doing. He helped Lirai back to her feet, steadying her with a hand at her waist. "Emma would have liked you," he added softly. "She was stubborn too." Lirai looked at him with sudden understanding, as if this rare mention of his daughter had revealed something important about Albert. She placed her six-fingered hand over his heart and made a gentle trilling sound that somehow conveyed compassion more eloquently than words ever could. Albert swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yeah, now let's try again." The breakthrough came 1 month after the prosthetics were attached. Albert was across the room, organizing their supplies, when he heard Lirai's excited trill. He turned to find her standing unassisted in the center of the room, her arms outstretched for balance, but not touching any support. "Look at you," he breathed, setting down his inventory list. With intense concentration, Lirai lifted her right prosthetic leg and moved it forward. Then the left. Right again. Left again. Each step was deliberate, wobbly, but undeniably successful. She walked, truly walked, across the room toward Albert, her face a canvas of triumph. When she reached him, Lyrae practically fell into his arms, her body trembling with exertion and emotion. Albert held her tightly, his own eyes wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. "You did it," he whispered in her fin-like ear structure. "You really did it." In that moment of shared victory and vulnerability, something shifted between them. Lyrae drew back slightly, her violet eyes searching his face. Then, with deliberate gentleness, she pressed her forehead against his, an intimate gesture from her culture that she had once tried to explain to him. Albert understood its significance. Tentatively, he raised a hand to cup her cheek, marveling at how the simple act of helping this alien girl had healed something broken inside himself. "We did it," he corrected softly. Together, the next several months brought a transformation to their lives. With Lyrae's increasing mobility came new possibilities. They expanded their territory, venturing farther from the shelter to find better resources. Lyrae proved to have an exceptional eye for salvage, identifying valuable alien artifacts that Albert would have overlooked. Their shelter evolved from a temporary haven into something closer to a home. Albert repaired the facility's structural weaknesses and restored more of its systems. Lyrae applied her innate understanding of her people's technology to create ingenious solutions to their daily challenges. A more efficient water filtration system, improved lighting, even a rudimentary communication device that could detect signals from distant sources. As Lyrae mastered her prosthetics, her confidence blossomed. She moved with increasing grace, the mechanical legs responding almost as naturally as flesh and bone. She developed her own distinct gait, slightly mechanical, but with an undeniable elegance that was uniquely hers. Their communication improved dramatically as well. Lyrae's facility with human speech grew, while Albert became more adept at understanding her native sounds and gestures. They developed a hybrid language of their own, a blend of words, trills, signs, and expressions that no one else in the wasteland could have comprehended. Through this enriched communication, they shared more of themselves with each other. Albert spoke of his life before the collapse, his work as an engineer, meeting Sarah, the joy of Emma's birth, their struggle to survive as society crumbled. Lyrae described her world before its fall, a civilization of remarkable technological achievement and artistic expression, its gradual decline as environmental catastrophes mounted, the fractured clans that emerged from the ruins. In the evenings, they would sit together at the entrance to their shelter, watching the strange, toxic sunsets paint the sky in unnatural hues. Sometimes they would talk, sharing memories or observations. Other times they would sit in comfortable silence, Lyrae's head resting against Albert's shoulder, his arm around her slender frame. It was during one such evening, as they watched a particularly spectacular aurora caused by radiation in the upper atmosphere, that Lyrae took Albert's hand and placed it over her heart. In their shared language, she told him that before he found her, she had been waiting to die. Now, she was learning to live again. Albert turned to her, struck by how the auroral light played across her luminescent skin, making her seem almost ethereal. "I was just surviving before," he admitted, "going through the motions. You reminded me what it means to actually live." Their foreheads touched, and in the glow of the toxic beauty above them, they acknowledged what had been growing between them for months, a connection that transcended species, a love born of shared struggle and mutual healing. Life settled into a rhythm that, while still fraught with the dangers of their environment, contained moments of genuine contentment. For the first time since losing his family, Albert found himself thinking about the future rather than just surviving until the next day. Lyrae had given him that gift, a reason to look forward, to plan, to hope. It was Lyrae who first noticed the signal. She had been tinkering with their communication device, expanding its range out of curiosity more than any practical purpose. The faint, rhythmic pulse she detected nearly escaped her notice, a pattern too regular to be random interference, too persistent to be a glitch. Albert, she called, her pronunciation of his name now almost perfect. Come listen. He joined her at the workbench, donning the crude headphones she had fashioned. The signal was weak but unmistakable, a deliberate transmission on a frequency that had been silent for years. Could be automated, Albert suggested, though excitement had already begun to build in his chest. Some old system finally getting enough power to broadcast. Lyrae shook her head. Her keen ears had detected subtle variations in the pattern that suggested manual operation. Someone was sending this signal intentionally. Someone alive. Over the next several days, they took turns monitoring the transmission. It maintained its steady rhythm, occasionally strengthening when atmospheric conditions were favorable. Through patient analysis, Lyrae determined it was coming from somewhere to the west, perhaps 100 miles distant. It could be a trap, Albert warned as they discussed the discovery. Scavengers sometimes use signals to lure in victims. Lyrae acknowledged the risk with a solemn nod, but her eyes betrayed her hope. The possibility of others, perhaps even some of her own kind, was too compelling to dismiss. As they debated their response, the signal suddenly changed. The rhythmic pulse was replaced by a voice, distorted by static, but clearly trying to communicate. Though the words were indecipherable, the voice didn't sound threatening. It sounded desperate. Someone needs help, Lyrae said simply. Albert ran a hand through his beard, conflicted. Their life here wasn't perfect, but it was stable. Safe, relatively speaking. Venturing toward an unknown signal meant risking everything they had built together. Yet as he looked around their shelter, at the life they had created from abandonment and desperation, he realized they couldn't ignore this call. If he had ignored Lyrae's tapping that day in the ruins, where would she be now? Where would he be? We'll need to prepare carefully, he said finally. The journey will be dangerous. Lyrae's face lit up with a smile that made her violet eyes sparkle like distant galaxies. She grasped his hands in hers, the 6 fingers curling around his 5 with familiar intimacy. Together, she said, using one of the first human words she had mastered. Together, Albert agreed. The preparations took 2 weeks. They needed to be thorough, as this would not be a short expedition like Albert's previous salvage runs. They packed essential supplies, tools, weapons, and communication equipment. Albert created a portable version of their signal detector to help them navigate toward the broadcast source. Lyrae's prosthetics required special consideration. While they functioned beautifully for normal movement, the harsh terrain would test their limits. Albert worked with her to make adjustments, reinforcing critical components and creating a repair kit to address potential damage on the journey. The morning of their departure dawned with an unusual clarity in the toxic sky. They stood at the entrance of the facility that had been their sanctuary and home for nearly a year, each carrying a pack designed for their specific needs and abilities. Albert took one last look at the space that had witnessed their remarkable journey together, from the desperate rescue of a dying alien girl to the forge of a bond stronger than either of them had thought possible. The shelter had served them well, but it had always been a temporary haven. Perhaps what waited beyond the horizon could be something more permanent. Ready? He asked, turning to Lyrae. She stood tall on her prosthetic legs, her luminescent skin glowing with determination, her violet eyes fixed on the distant horizon. From a small pouch at her waist, she withdrew a simple object, a pendant she had crafted from salvaged materials during her recovery. It contained a tiny fragment of the crystalline material from her prosthetics, encased in a metal frame shaped like 2 hands clasped together. With solemn ceremony, she placed the pendant around Albert's neck. In their shared language, she explained its significance, a token of protection in her culture, a promise that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Albert touched the pendant, deeply moved by the gesture. In return, he removed the tarnished gold band he had worn on a cord around his neck since finding Lyrae, his wedding ring, the last physical connection to his past life. I've been holding on to this as a reminder of what I lost, he said as he placed it in Lyrae's palm. Now I want it to be a symbol of what I've found. Lyrae closed her 6 fingers around the ring, then carefully secured it alongside her few personal possessions. No further words were necessary. The exchange said everything that mattered. Together, they stepped out of the shelter and into the vast unknown, their path guided by a mysterious signal and their hearts by the bond they had forged in the ruins of two civilizations. The wasteland stretched before them, hostile and unforgiving as ever. Yet as Albert glanced at Lyra walking steadily beside him, her mechanical legs moving with confident strides, he felt something he had long thought impossible in this broken world. Hope. The signal beckoned from the west, growing stronger with each passing day of their journey. Whether it led to danger or salvation remained to be seen, but whatever awaited them, they would face it together, the scavenger and the alien girl, hand in hand, heart to heart, writing their own story amid the ashes of fallen worlds.